All right, this is going to be the first of most likely 3 sections on methodology. There we go. Try to get the slide up there. Okay, the first thing that I mentioned in class was that methodology refers to whatever we do to get information, not only in anthropology but in other disciplines as well. All right, so methods. If I ask you what methods are or methodology is, say it's whatever that whatever you need to do to get the information, and in whatever kind of study you're conducting. Then we briefly talked about the origin of methodology in anthropology, and in order to do that, we started with sort of the earliest days of anthropology before there was any such thing. We talked a little bit about the history of the discipline and how it co-evolved with sociology. We did that on the first day. We brought it up again here, and I pointed out that once anthropology began to be established as a discipline in the 19th century, in the 1800s, some anthropologists took an interest in where it all began, and they looked back toward the colonial period of Europe, right? When Europe, between say 1492 and the mid 19th century, were sending people out to explore the world, mostly because of the Industrial Revolution and the mercantile system before the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution once it started. They were looking for new resources, including natural resources, human resources, people to work, new land, all kinds of things. And they were encountering new people around the world. All right, so this is before anthropology started, before science was formalized in many cases. But anthropologists in the 19th, early 20th century looked back at that time as sort of the origin of anthropology. And they called the anthropologists, the pre-anthropologists, armchair anthropologists. Right, and they were people who, between 1500 and 1800s, and they were people who were trained in other disciplines and took an interest in the accounts that came back from people who went out exploring from Western Europe. Right, so the anthropologists retroactively applied this term armchair anthropology to those individuals because they read other people's accounts. In other words, they did not have a methodology for the field. Right, the field is wherever the people are that you're studying. They didn't go out into the field. They stayed at home, stayed in their offices, sat in armchairs, presumably. Probably in some cases they did, but it doesn't really matter whether they did or didn't. The point is they stayed home. Right. So that name was given to them retroactively by later anthropologists when they were studying the history of the thing. All right. At a certain point, those armchair anthropologists decided that they needed to go out and get their own information, probably toward the early 1800s. And that's when the discipline began to be formed. Right? And it was formed around something called field work. Field work, once again, the field is wherever the people are that you're studying. All right, so field work is going out to where the people are to study them. And I say people because we're talking about anthropology. If we were in the biology department, we were studying bears, the field would be wherever the bears are. All right, it's wherever your research subjects are. So field work just means you leave your office and you go out to where the people are and you study them there in situ. This has been going on since the early 1800s. And remember Franz Boas and the 4 fields in the United States. Obviously, archaeologists were some of the first to get out there in the fields, but the cultural anthropologists were out there too, working directly with groups of people in the American West, right, in the early 1800s. To this day, it's considered to be standard within anthropology to do field work, and not only to do that, but to do it for an extended time, and during the first field work, and revisit field work that you've done in the past, particularly if you're doing cultural anthropology. This term that I may have already mentioned in other cases, longitudinal studies, longitudinal, Longitudinal, that may come up on an exam. Longitudinal study is one that takes place over a number of years. Right, it goes on for an extended period of time, so you revisit the same people over and over if you're talking about ethnographic research. So that became fairly common in anthropology as well. But fieldwork is a standard. It's something that was developed in anthropology because of their unique subject matter. Remember that sociology was developing along the same time, along the same historical trajectory as anthropology through the 19th century into the 20th. And one of the distinctions was that sociologists focused on the Western world and anthropologists focused on the non-Western world. Right? Because anthropologists were looking at the non-Western world, that is less developed countries, people that were not integrated into the global capitalist system, were living at a simpler subsistence level. They developed field work largely because there was no other way to engage people who didn't produce a history necessarily, not a written history anyway, and they had to just go out there and see what they were doing. Right, so field work was particular to anthropology early on, where people were concerned. Sociologists didn't do it in the early days. Today, you can find sociologists that do field work just like anthropologists. There's been a fair amount of overlap in terms of the development of theory and method in both disciplines. Right, so that's field work. Armchair anthropology was what was seen as a predecessor to the development of field work. All right. Ethnography and ethnology are important terms. We need to know both of those. Obviously, they sound a lot alike. They're spelled pretty closely. Whenever you see stuff like this, break it down. Right, whenever you see ethno, it comes from ethnos in Greek, or it has to do with ethnicities, something to do with ethnic studies. Graph means to write or draw something, and ethnography, and that's one way you can distinguish the two. The other one's got ology on the end of it. The first one's got a graph on it. And ethnography is a detailed study of one culture, and they probably chose that name for it, that the graph ending, because it often ends in writing a book. Right, and that book itself is called an ethnography. Right, I can go out into the field and do ethnography. Right, I can engage in an ethnographic study or engage in ethnography. Those are two different ways I can use the word. One's a noun form of the word, one's an adjective form. Descriptive one's ethnographic. In any case, an ethnography is a detailed study of one culture. If you're engaged in ethnography, you're doing a detailed study of one culture. Right. It may or may not be a longitudinal study, but it's a detailed study of one culture. That's ethnography, Graphy. Ethnology, obviously it has to do with ethnicity. Ology means study of generally, and ethnology refers to the comparative study across cultures. All right, so you do an ethnography to get a detailed account of one culture, and then in an ethnological project, you may compare across those ethnographies. So ethnology, study of it is a comparison across different ethnographic studies. Ethnography is just a detailed study of one culture. Now, for ethnology, I gave an example. For ethnography, I gave an example of Napoleon Chagnon's book, Yanomamo, The Fierce People. That's the one we read a chapter of in class. So everybody should be kind of familiar with that. Note it's a really small, skinny little book. It's only about 120, 130 pages. Some of them are much longer. For ethnology, I gave the example of the HRAF, which stands for Human Relations Area File. Human Relations Area Files. This is their website, right? So you can actually go on there and look to see what they have to say. What they have to say is cross-cultural research, and that's what they do. In most cases, they're focused on quantitative data. Quantitative data are data that you can count, as opposed to qualitative data. Think quantity and quality. Quantity, something you can assign a number to. Quality, something you can't assign a number to. Right? So the HRAF is a project originating in New Haven, Connecticut. I believe it still is based there. There's some connection to Yale, I'm not sure. I think George Murdoch was either the founder or was running it for a period of time. I'm not sure exactly the history of that, but he's well known for writing a number of anthro textbooks, at least, probably other things as well. Like running the HRF, for example. All right. I didn't click on anything. This is just a screenshot to show you that the thing exists and that it says cross-cultural all over it. It is an ethnological project. And again, they focus on quantitative data, so they look at a bunch of different ethnographic studies. Last I heard, it was something like 190 different cultures were represented. And they take the quantitative data out of that, they feed that into databases so you can run your own statistical analyses of those data. All right. So that's what the HRF is. Most universities of any size subscribe to at least some of their databases. They have, I believe they have a number of different ones. All right. I haven't checked to see what Cortland has subscriptions to, but I'm sure they have a subscription to at least one or two of them. So that's HRAF. All right, just making sure, no, didn't miss anything on there. Ethnography, ethnology. Those are the two terms that you especially need to understand and understand how they relate to each other. Tools of ethnography. Here we get into the actual methodology. This has to do with how we get information. All right, participant observation is at the top of the list, and again, that's a tool that was developed in anthropology due to its unique nature. Now, anthropologists are going out to remote places initially and studying groups of people in often in villages, in mobile bands, things like that. And in order to get at what they're doing, they would try to live with the people. So they would move into an area where the people live. They don't just go to the field, they live in the field. And they observe as an outsider while also trying to take part in what the people are doing in their day-to-day lives. And the idea of this was to get at both the emic and the etic perspectives. Sorry, I went back too far. Hang on. There we go. Sorry, getting back to the right animation. Get both the emic and etic perspectives. Emic is the subjective perspective of people who are being studied. Say that again. Emic is the subjective perspective of the people who are being studied. So if you go out to study a bunch of people and you see them playing rugby, and you go up and ask them, what are you doing? Whatever they tell you they're doing is the emic perspective. Now, as an outsider, you're coming in, you can provide the etic perspective, E-T-I-C. Right, that is the objective perspective of the outsider observing. So pretty much all of the time, the etic perspective is going to be provided by the anthropologist. The anthropologist is also trying to understand the emic perspective through the participant part of participant observation. The two parts of participant observation: one, you observe as an outsider; two, you try to participate and understand as an insider. So you get both the emic and the etic perspectives. I did mention that in class that these two came from terms in linguistics, phoneme and phonetic, and the distinction between those mirrors the distinction between the emic and etic. They were brought into the discipline during the literary turn. I believe it was Victor Turner who introduced those, and it was taken directly out of linguistics. So you'll understand them better even when we get to linguistics. If you want to look up phoneme and phonetic, go ahead, but the distinction is similar. It's just they're talking about sounds in that case. All right, so we'll talk about that again when we get to linguistics. For now, you just need to know emic and etic and participant observation. You should also be able to distinguish participant observation from field work. Right, field work, as I said, is just going out to where the people are. That doesn't necessarily mean you do anything in particular. You may do field work and engage in participant observation. You may just do observation and not try to participate at all. You may also do something called interviewing in the field. Interviewing is a direct questioning of an informant. An informant's also called a cultural consultant. We'll get to that later as well. Right, so interviewing is a direct questioning of an informant, and usually people think of an interview and they think of something like the bottom left-hand picture. Right, two people sitting across from each other, one's asking the other one questions. That is definitely an interview, but it's one form of an interview. You can also include any kind of direct questioning, even if it's in writing. Surveys are a form of interviewing. Right, so there are a lot of different forms that an interview can take. You can do it online. Somebody can log into your website and answer a bunch of questions. That's still interviewing. Right. So there are a lot of different ways to do it. There are two major types of interviews and interview questions: structured and unstructured. This is important to know for the exam. Every one of these terms is important to know. I try to point out ones that you might not be sure of. Structured and unstructured interviews. Those are important. Right. So in a structured interview, the person asking questions would control the potential answers that can be given to the questions. Right. In an unstructured interview, the person asking questions would not control the potential answers given by the informant. Right. So an example of a structured interview question is, how do you feel about dogs on a scale of 1 to 10? 1 being I hate dogs and 10 being I love dogs. Right, and somebody's going to give you a number. So they only have a number from 1 to 10 that they can give you. So that's a structured interview question. Now, if you just go and ask, how do you feel about dogs? That's an unstructured interview question. Right, they could start telling you a story about when they were a kid and they had a dog, and so they had mixed feelings about dogs, and get into all this other detail that would be ruled out by a structured interview question. So what's the advantage of a structured interview question? It's more targeted in terms of the information that you get. So you don't have to weed through a whole bunch of other information to get at the one thing that you're interested in. Downside is, of course, that you don't get as much information, but it's a lot easier to work with, right? Because you can be more targeted. Unstructured interviews, the advantage obviously is not that it's easy to work with, but and the same as the distinction between qualitative and quantitative. We'll get to that in a minute. Unstructured interviews yield a lot more information. So if you want the maximum amount of information, you don't mind spending time sifting through it, then go unstructured. If you really need to get to one particular point and you don't want to spend a lot of time analyzing the data, structured is going to be more helpful to you. Field notes, we talked briefly about field notes. That's whatever you do basically to to keep track of the information that you get in the field. So it's just what it sounds like. Traditionally, people did write in notebooks. Just bring a notebook to write everything down. On the other hand, in class I talked about the fact that different people will have different thresholds for you taking notes on them. Also recording them. Field notes can also be recorded in audio form and visual form. Pretty much any way you can think to record information has been used to take field notes. Excuse me. Yeah, field note. People have different thresholds for all those things. Right. Some people may hate the fact that you're writing something down, and they may change their behavior as a result of your observation. And I gave everybody a term for that as well. It's called the Hawthorne effect. Hawthorne effect, like Nathaniel Hawthorne, although he didn't have anything to do with it. Hawthorne effect. That refers to a known phenomenon, which is that people change their behavior when they realize that they're being observed. And you can probably think of that, if you think about that in real concrete terms, I'm sure you would agree that that exists. If somebody's following you around writing stuff in a notebook all day, you might not behave exactly the way that you would if they weren't following you around. Right, that's called the Hawthorne effect. So in order to avoid that, people use different means of collecting field notes. One of the things that almost all anthropologists do out in the field is they just develop their memory. So in the short term in particular, right? So they go out, engage in activities with people, maybe talk to them, and maybe ask them questions formally, maybe not. They just memorize all that stuff until they can get somewhere where they're out of the way and they can make notes in whatever way they want to, right? So they try to, and it's not that people don't remember things that happen to them during the day, but they don't usually remember in great detail. So you have to kind of train your memory to hold that information until you can get somewhere where you can record it. As I said, you could use audio and video too, but those sometimes that's not a problem for people. Sometimes it is a problem for people, and it makes it much more difficult to get information. So you have to use your own judgment in terms of the best way to keep track of field notes. We also talked briefly about coding field notes. Coding, it's a normal word, C-O-D-I-N-G, coding. That's what you do when you go through your field notes, and you basically organize them according to topics, right? So suppose you're interested in marriage practices and you got all this unstructured information that people have given you through stories and all that. You go through with a highlighter, and everything to do with wedding ceremonies you make pink, and everything to do with divorce practices you make green, and maybe you'll color code all that stuff. There are a bunch of different ways you can keep track of it, but that process of sorting out your field notes and categorizing it is known as coding notes. Right, so that may come up as well. All right, so basic methods in anthropology, in ethnography and anthropology in general. We already said that. Don't need to dwell on that. Okay, information analysis. Here's the quantitative distinction. We want to get to that. Data, datum, data. Everybody knows what data are. That's what the term we use to refer to the information that we collect and organize. Data or data. I don't care how you pronounce it. Datum is a term that I put on there just to emphasize that data is a plural word. Data, I'll say it again, data is a plural word. It comes directly from a Latin word used in English, being information. It's a Latin neuter noun, and neuter nouns in Latin have um as a singular ending and a as a plural ending. That's why it is the way it is, if anybody cares. Again, the reason I put it up there is so that people don't make a grammatical error when they're writing. People that know the difference will notice. It's these data, those data, not this data, that data. I've seen the word datum used in writing exactly one time in my life. I don't think I've ever heard it in a normal conversation. It was by Steven Pinker, who was a linguist. That was the only, and he was talking about a single piece of data, a piece of datum. So just use data as normal, but remember it's plural. All right. So qualitative, quantitative. I already very quickly pointed out the difference between these two. Quantitative, again, it refers to things that you can assign a number to, things that you can count. All right, so you can talk about quantitative research, where you just try to collect that kind of data. You can talk about quantitative data, which are the numerical data that you get out of an ethnographic, any ethnographic research, or any research. Qualitative research refers to things you cannot count. Right, so you can mirror that to the structured and unstructured interview questions. Structured interview questions are meant to produce quantitative data in many cases. They may not be. Right? For example, you may limit somebody to a yes-no response. That doesn't necessarily provide you quantitative data, although it can be it can be converted to quantitative very easy. Make a yes a 1 and an no a 0, and you got quantitative data. So anytime you limit, you're more likely to produce quantitative data, usually intentionally. Unstructured interview questions tend to yield qualitative data. Right? You get a lot of stories, take a lot of time to analyze. Once again, you get more information, but it's less organized, less targeted. All right. This was a section in which I intended to talk a little bit about ethics, and will end up talking about a couple of other things, some of the sort of basic structure of doing this kind of stuff. Right? We talked about the term informant before. It's worth mentioning that the term cultural consultant is also used, and that largely has to do with anthropologists shifting from just focusing on the non-Western world back into the Western world, where they're dealing with people who speak English, maybe, or other Germanic languages, other Romance languages, other languages that were influenced by Roman in olden times, and so they are familiar with the idea of informant, and a lot of times it has a negative connotation. So as anthropologists shifted back toward the West, they didn't shift completely back toward the West, but they started doing more work in the West. That was more often a problem, so people shifted from informant to cultural consultant. So you may see both of those in print. You may hear both of them in conversation. Particularly if you're reading older things, you'll hear informant more than cultural consultant. All right. Now, ethics is about protecting informants or cultural consultants in large part. It's also about not getting your university sued and not causing liability issues in general. But you definitely don't want to hurt your research subjects. And toward that end, there's something called informed consent, which was developed in order to protect these informants. It was based on the idea that a lot of work had been done in the past where there was no consent. People just would go out and start studying people and then let the chips fall where they may. That was very irresponsible, and in many cases people did get hurt from that. I mean, think about collecting information from groups of people who are potentially vulnerable to other groups of people and publishing it. You can get people in trouble, you can make them targets, all kinds of bad things can happen. So informed consent is about protecting those individuals. The idea was you can't just go and ask them, do you consent to this in a foreign language and have them, draw an X and call it good. It's not good enough. Informed consent is the idea that people need to understand what you're doing. They need to understand why you're doing it. They need to understand how that can affect them in any way, whether it's positive or negative. Right? So they have to have a full understanding of what is going on and what they're consenting to. And that came out of the medical disciplines. And I used to know the name of the guy who actually coined the term, but either way, I believe it was a medical doctor. And obviously, they would have a need for informed consent. They're doing research on human subjects all the time. Anytime you do research on human subjects, your university at least, and funding agencies, we'll get to that in a second here too, these people are all going to be concerned that you have the informed consent of those subjects. All right, so they will write that into conditions on their research. Now, who's they? We've got the IRB to the right here, and funding agencies. Let's start with the funding agencies. First of all, in order to do ethnographic research, it's fairly expensive. So usually some people can self-fund. We'll come back to that too. Most people cannot, or even don't want to, even if they have money. We're talking about thousands of dollars. If somebody does their first research and it lasts a year, then they have to have living expenses for a year. Most people can't just live somewhere for a year on their own dime. So you go to funding agencies. There are different types. There are public and private funding agencies. Wenner-Gren is an example of a private funding agency. That's the one that begins with a W, is pronounced with V, Wenner-Gren. And that is, to my knowledge, the only private funding agency for ethnographic research. Like, that is what they do. And where does their money come from? It comes from private donors. That is, people who have a lot of money, either because they make a lot of money or they inherited a lot of money, and they value the work that ethnologists do. Ethnologists, the person who does ethnography, right? They value that kind of work, and so they want to donate to it. So they make donations. They have events and fundraising drives and things like that among that small class of wealthy donors who support this sort of thing. So Wenner-Gren, private agency, comes from private donors. Wenner-Gren, if they fund your research, they can put conditions on your research, right? So informed consent is almost always one of those conditions. They have a bunch of other conditions that you have to meet as well, that's just the nature. If somebody's paying for your work, then they have a say in how it gets done, within reason. They don't really want to corrupt your work. I mean, they don't want to push you to come to a certain result or anything like that. They usually, but they do put things in place that'll protect your subjects and protect their own interests, insofar as they're able to do. In some cases, they put conditions on money as well. If, for example, you're going to study a region that spans 200 miles and several different groups of people, and you need a car, and you can buy a car in the local economy that'll do the job for $2,000. You may be able to put that in the budget. They may agree to that, but they may also put the condition on it that once you get done using that car, you sell it and recover as much of the cost as you can. Right. So some stuff you do have to pay back if you agree to it. If you don't agree to it, then they'll tell you to go away. But anyway, they can put those kinds of restrictions on. Another restriction that they often put on is stuff like evacuation insurance. Evacuation insurance is when everybody's familiar with insurance, health insurance, right? You get sick, you go to the doctor, they'll take you to the hospital and pay the bills. Evacuation insurance is for special circumstances that anthropologists may find themselves in. Like, for example, Chagnon in the Brazilian rainforest, or Venezuelan, wherever he was, in the rainforest, and there's not a hospital within 300 miles. All right, so evacuation insurance would give him, probably a satellite phone today. I don't know about in the 60s, but today we have satellite phones, and basically you can make a phone call, and they will send in a helicopter and drag you out of there and take you to the nearest Western facilities. It may be 300, 400, 500 miles. So that's evacuation insurance. As you can imagine, it's an extremely expensive thing to have happen. Somebody sent a helicopter to get you, so you want to have insurance for that. Funding agencies certainly don't want to be held liable for that. Things do happen. Venegrin. Next one below that is NSF. That stands for National Science Foundation. I also mentioned the National Endowment for the Arts, NEA, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, NEH. I put NSF up there because that's the most common one for the funding of ethnographic research. Most of the people that I know that have drawn federal grants have gone through the NSF. There are some, depending on the nature of the project, and especially since anthropology is so broad, some people have done things that fit with the agenda of the National Endowment for the Arts or Humanities. Right, so those are different funding agencies. All of them have national at the front, and they are federal funding, and that means it comes from taxpayer money. Right, so ultimately, the agendas of those places change. Venegrin's agenda changes as well, but it's private, and they have a board, and whoever's on the board sets the agenda more or less, and that may change. It may change week to week. It may change in an afternoon, depending on what they think is important. NSF is also tied to whoever's in office at the time. Right, so all of the federal agencies, their agendas get set in part by whoever's running them, and that changes every time we have an election, more or less. So the idea is that federal money, or taxpayer money, the federal government has money because taxpayers pay taxes. So it's taxpayer money is going into something. So the idea is it should benefit the country in some way. And sometimes that's been seen as pork. Probably everybody's heard of pork in terms of federal funds. People talk about it all the time. It's something that ought to be eliminated. Occasionally, when somebody's out to get rid of some of this pork, they look at the federal funding agencies for research, and they pull out the most ridiculous things that have been funded in the history of humanity, and stuff with titles that sound ridiculous, and they'll read them out on their Congress floor and everything. And sometimes that leads to cuts and changes. Sometimes it does not. Depends on who's running things. In any case, that's another source of funding. There are other private agencies that are not specifically for anthropology, like Ford Foundation, National Geographic. National Geographic is actually one that's funded a fair amount of anthropology, although they do other stuff as well. There's a lake that's populated with sharks, like Lake Nicaragua or something, and they're interested in that. They may fund a team that's studying the sharks in the lake, right? That's got nothing to do with anthropology, but National Geographic does like anthropology in general. So they have funded a number of anthropologists, and one of the conditions they put on it, which is unusual, is they require you to give them first publication rights. Now, usually that's a good deal for everybody. I don't know anybody that's complained about getting a National Geographic grant. because their information gets immediately published in National Geographic. And they have a TV show, not a TV show, they have a TV channel. So they may do a video documentary on it. They may publish in their magazine, which has been going since the 19th century. I mean, it was being published in the late 1800s, probably mid to late 1800s. All right, so that's an old magazine that it's a good publication for a lot of people, even though it's more of a popular thing than an academic thing. All right, so National Geographic is a good funding agency. That's also private. That's not federally funded. I don't know if there's any federal money that goes to National Geographic, but it's a private organization. So, all right. So those are the sources of money. If you take money from any of those sources, it gets funneled through the foundation at the university. All right, that's the name they give the institution that takes care of money that comes into the university. It's the foundation. Every university that does any kind of research has an institutional review board. It's called an IRB. I just got an email about the IRB at Cortland. It was, I don't know if it was sent out to just the faculty. I think it was. And it was like, get to know your IRB. So they had a meeting of some kind. People could go and talk to people on the IRB and stuff. Now, in any case, if a university has any people that are doing research on human subjects or animal subjects, right, and they're taking external funding, that goes through the university foundation and therefore is the business of the IRB. Now, the IRB is going to be made up of people who are experts on research, right? So faculty members most likely, and administrative members who are looking out for the interests of the university, and a bunch of lawyers will most likely be involved in that as well. All right, they don't want you to hurt anybody. They also don't want the university to get sued. All right, so they have their own interests. Part of their interests are generally ethical. They don't want you to do damage to them. They don't want you to do damage to your research subjects. Don't want you to damage the university, either as a public relations issue or as a monetary issue. All right, they don't want to get sued for a lot of money, but they also don't want to look bad. So the IRB will have to approve your research. So you go to the funding agencies, you get approval, you get funding, then it gets kicked over to the IRB at the university you're working at, and then you have to make sure you meet all their requirements. Even if the funding agency doesn't put certain requirements on you, the IRB can put more on, right? So you have to make sure they're all satisfied. Once they are, then you can go and do your research. All right, now how do you get around all this? Suppose you didn't want to deal with any of this stuff, and you didn't want to waste time applying for things and getting money from other people, and you didn't want to deal with the IRB at all, even though you're working at a university. If you are independently wealthy and you can fund your own research, then you don't have to worry about any of that. Now, you can go out and do any kind of research you want if you have the money to do it. That's kind of the nature of the world, actually. So I don't think that's particular to anthropology at all. If you have the means, you can kind of do what you want within reason. All right, so that was the ethics section. And we're going to break that one off there. The next section coming up is a little bit longer. It's a shift of gears. I think I'm going to be able to whittle that one down quite a lot. So we'll break this one here and look for the next video as soon as I can get it. Oops, escape out of that. And stop, thank you.